I'd like to welcome Dr. Belinda Robson from Murdoch University. Dr. Belinda has been researching the conservation, restoration and management of rivers and wetlands for more than 30 years, publishing over 80 research books, book chapters and scientific papers. Her current research focuses on the devastating effects of climatic drying on freshwater biodiversity and how we can prevent further losses. Thank you, Belinda.
Okay, thanks Denise. Thanks everyone for coming to my talk today. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wet'suwet'en people and to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations people across the southwest, because I'm not just going to be talking about metro area today. So this talk is about introducing to you a new project. We've just got the funding for it. We haven't actually started work yet. And the funding's come from a state NRM community collaboration grant to Ed Chester and myself, and with the collaboration between Perth NRM. There's also several other community groups involved. And individual members of the community, and I just didn't have room to put everybody up here. And I'm hoping that we might get some more volunteers to add to that list as well. So what I'm going to do today then is spend some time on why we need this project, because I do think it's important. What we're then trying to do with the project. And lastly, how you can get involved if you'd like to participate as a citizen scientist in the project. All right, so why do we need this project? Now, I'm going to show you what I call my scary graphs. There's a few of them. I teach climate change adaptation to master's students at Murdoch University. And so we do spend a bit of time now talking about how people feel when they're confronted with climate change information, because it's certainly become apparent to me, teaching these students who come from all different parts of the world, a whole different range of age groups and levels of experience of the world, that a lot of it is confronting. And what I say to them is to remember that, yes, it's confronting, yes, it's scary, but you are not having to deal with this alone. We all have to work on solving these problems together, and I do think that there are things that we can do. Right, so having said that, I'm now going to proceed to scare everybody. So this is just a little bit from the most recent Bureau of Meteorology climate report, pointing out that our climate's warmed on average by 1.44 degrees since 1910. And you'll remember that the recent big climate conference in Scotland was about trying to keep the world to 1.5 degrees. And this is a recent headline from the ABC from January this year. So we know about heat, and we all experience the increase in heat. An increase in heat will affect aquatic plants and animals, even though they're under the water. We have increased evaporation, we have increased water temperatures. But we also have increased frequencies of extreme events as well. So this is a graph, international, it's a global insurance data graph from 1980 to 2019. And as it shows, in the 80s we had fewer than 300 claimable extreme events in a year, and now we're over the 800 mark. And they're composed into different types of extreme events. So we have things like earthquakes and so on at the bottom here in orange. Then we've got a big change in meteorological events, which are essentially storms, different types of storms. Hydrological events, which is things like flooding and landslides. And we're seeing a bit of flooding across northern and northeastern Australia at the moment. And then up the top here we have what they call climatological events, and this is what affects us most here in the southwest. This is extreme temperature or heat waves, drought and wildfire. All right, now this is from Deep Herd, and this is showing changes to rainfall. And although we have increased extreme events and we have increased temperatures, probably the most profound effect that's happened as a result of climate change here in the southwest is on rainfall. Now, obviously, aquatic plants and animals need water. The water they live in comes from a mixture of groundwater and surface water, and so rainfall is really important. So what this graph shows is it shows that southwest corner here. It shows the old rainfall isohyet. So what this is, I think, 115 millimetres per annum, all the way down to 700 millimetres per annum in the wetter parts. And it shows how these isohyets have moved westward as the climate is drying. So we have the drying in the wheatbelt moving a lot. This isohyet here, which is the 225 millimetre one, has moved substantially westward. So we're seeing a lot less rainfall each year in the wheatbelt, and we're also seeing contractions in rainfall in the Perth Hills and on the coastal plain. So our aquatic fauna and flora is adapted to the Mediterranean climate. We have dry, hot summers and cool, wet winters, and a lot of our water bodies have always dried out. But the thing that there's a few things we need to think about in understanding how our fauna might be going to deal with this increased drying. A lot of our fauna in particular is actually on the edge of its tolerances. It's what we call a cool relictual fauna. It's evolved in cooler, wetter times, back when this continent was part of Gondwana. So a lot of our species are sort of just hanging on. They're not right in the prime area of their tolerances already. So when we had a landscape of uninterrupted native vegetation, that's what the green spots indicate, we didn't have any salinisation of our aquatic systems, we would have lots of connections in winter and spring, wetlands full of water, animals able to move across from wetland to wetland, whether that was turtles walking or birds flying or insects flying. We had stream pools and streams connected and water flowing. And then in summer and autumn, if the stream dried out, the animals would start to move into those perennial waterholes and wait out the dry period in those waterholes, which we call drought refuges. Nothing happened then. All right, so then in the wetlands, in summer and autumn, some of them would dry out, and then animals again could move into the perennial wetlands and wait out. Now, some of our animals do stay in the seasonal wetlands in various types of dormancy as well. But because the landscape was continuously vegetated, there was lots of protection for moving animals from predation, from drying, from low humidity and from heat. Okay, and then we also mustn't forget that we also get some animals that move between rivers and wetlands as well. So our freshwater fauna is quite mobile. They do often use more than one water body during their life cycle, and as the seasons change, they move in both directions, potentially. All right, now when we have a landscape that doesn't look like that anymore, we have a landscape where we have a lot of clearing. So we might just have thin strips of vegetation running along our rivers and streams. We have some wetlands inside nature reserves, little squares of native vegetation. But around that, we have urban land and rural land, and that can be very hot, very exposed, and it can be very difficult for not just frogs and turtles, but also insects to move through hot, open, windy, dry landscapes with no shade and no vegetation. So they go through the same processes. In winter and spring, when everything's inundated, they move around. The other thing that I meant to say here too is that I've removed some of the wetlands that I had on the previous slide because we've lost wetlands, as people have already talked about at the conference. So then when we get drying again, summer and autumn, animals are still trying to move into the perennial water holes. It's now more difficult for a lot of animals to move because of all the clearing. So some things are going to be restricted to surviving in that wetland, and if they can't survive drying, then they won't be able to persist there. And we might see a little bit of movement between wetlands, but it's going to be less because it's more challenging. And the longer distances are going to become more difficult as well. Waterbirds being probably the exception to that because they are capable of pretty long distance flights. So we've lost aquatic habitat to salinisation, we've lost wetlands to drainage, we've lost the vegetation from a lot of our landscapes, and then we are losing perennial water bodies as well. So streams that used to flow year round now dry out, water holes that used to stay inundated dry out, and wetlands that used to stay inundated dry out. So you can see that for aquatic animals, we have a problem. And I have had people say to me, well, Australia's a dry country, we've had long periods of drying before, surely our plants and animals will just cope and afterwards they'll start to come back. But there's a few things to remember. Dryings happen really rapidly compared to past geological drying. It's really quick. So it doesn't give really the opportunity for most things to actually do evolution. It's too quick for evolution to play a role. Our fauna, as I said, is a relic of cooler, wetter times. A lot of our species are already on the edge. A lot of our species are endemic. They're found nowhere else in the world. And we've drastically changed our landscapes. So it is more difficult for animals to find refuges and more difficult for them to persist. And this includes in nature reserves, in the places that were set aside for conservation. So the refuges we have from drying then for freshwater species are fewer and further apart than before. Now I want to show you a couple of pieces of research that we published last year in Global Change Biology, which is one of the main international journals for looking at climate change impacts and what we can do about them. So this, as you can see, covers the southwest. It's wheatbelt. These are all different lakes. Now this is data collected by DBCA over a long period from 1998 to 2011. And they went and sampled these wetlands in the spring, which is the time for maximum diversity and the time for maximum water levels. And so over that time, as they sampled, what they found was that the wetlands they visited that were dry in the spring when they should be inundated increased over time, as you can see in this top graph. And at the same time, plotting against years again here, this is the total richness, so the number of invertebrate species across all the 17 wetlands, declined from over 300 down to just over 100. And the graph down the bottom here makes that even clearer, because here we plotted the years against the proportion of dry samples and that total richness, the species pool richness. So we've gone from 300 species to just over 100. And almost all of these are wetlands in nature reserves. So this is our conservation state. So now sometimes in winter and spring, it's difficult to take samples. As you can see here, Scott's having trouble getting water in his net. And this is Lake Forestdale, which is a Ramsar wetland. And when we look at the rivers, you may have seen this graph before. This is Water Corporation graph from their website. This is flows in gigalitres into Perth Hill, the dams in the Perth Hills. Now that flow that gets into the dams flows downstream channels. So before it ends up in our reservoirs, it's providing habitat for aquatic plants and animals and protected water catchments. So again, really good places for conservation on the whole. We've got from 1910 here up to 2021, we've got this first period here. So these colours here, the blocks, are the water court interpretations, basically saying that in the late 70s, we saw a step change in rainfall. And you can really see that because you can see that these very high rainfall years just stopped and they haven't returned. And then in the up to 2000, we then have another step change, and then since then we have another step change, and here we are here. This is the 2021 data. So again, we've gone from really variable, but usually over 400 gigalitres per year of flow.
Have we got some tissues?
Down to, you know, around 100 gigalitres, and in some years, almost no flow as well. So some years like 2010, 11, we had almost non-measurable flow into dams. So what's happened? So yes, rainfall's declined, but why has it had this huge effect on stream flow? So there's been a lot of hydrological work done by people from CSIRO and Department of Water and so on. And basically what's happened is that streams have become detached from groundwater. So originally we had a lot of groundwater flowing into streams and we had surface water flowing in. And during the winter and spring, these little surface aquifers form from rainfall and they feed extra flow, but the base flow, the year-round flow, comes from the groundwater. And over time, the streams went from what we call gaining to losing, meaning that water that came in was then moving down into the groundwater, to now being perched. So the groundwater's down here and the stream water's up here. So the groundwater isn't flowing into a lot of streams anymore. So they flow in winter and spring from those perched aquifers, the temporary ones created by the rain, but then they dry out because there's no groundwater to come in summer and autumn and provide that base flow. So if we look at flow records from streams in the Perth Hills, so this is the Wollongong catchment, we can see again we've got from 1980 through here to I think about 2018. You can see that the annual discharge in the Wollongong Brook has gone down and down and down. If we plot that on a log scale, we can see it's pretty stable, it's perennial, and then in the mid-2000s it dries out for the first time in the record, and it's dried out every year since. So for animals that lived in the Wollongong Brook were used to perennial flow, there was this major step change in their habitat. Suddenly, for several months of the year, there was no flow and potentially no standing water either. Certainly now the big pools on the Wollongong Brook all dry out in the summer. Now that blue arrow is there to remind me to say that in the early 80s, now Professor Stuart Budd did his PhD in the streams in this catchment. So we were able to use his data to go back and see what was there now compared to what had been there when everything in the catchment was perennial. So this top stream up here, Waterfall Gully, it's still perennial, it's spring fed and it still flows year round. All of the other streams in the catchment are now intermittent. Now he recorded the life histories of the 13 most common invertebrates. Now invertebrates are the most diverse of all our freshwater fauna. There's, as I showed you with the wetlands, there's hundreds of species, whereas with fish or frogs or plants even, there's fewer species. So they're really good for looking at diversity. The 13 most common species were dragonfly, some caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, and an amphipod, which is like a little shrimp crustacean. When Nicole, PhD student, went back, she looked for the same 13 species. And what she found was that 7 of those 13 were no longer found in these streams, they were only in Waterfall Gully. So they were hanging on in that one perennial stream, which makes that stream really important. 2 species have disappeared altogether, and 4 had adapted to life in intermittent streams by changing the timing of their life history and by using some spring-fed perennial pools that are still present in a couple of these streams. So I want to emphasise that these are common species. These are not the rare species, the things that were just hanging on in the past. These are the ones that that we have historically thought, well, they're common, so they must be okay. But they are relictual species. They're perennial water animals. And so the majority of them can't cope with drying. So it means that that one perennial stream is now really important. And those perennial spring-fed waterholes are also really important for keeping these species in the catchment. Now, it's not just invertebrates. There's other people who have been looking at frogs, for example. So this toadlet, a nice study also in global change biology about this frog, shows population fragmentation because of clearing. It shows limited gene flow and so potentially a limited capacity to adapt. So we need to actually do something about all of this. It's not a future happening, it's already happened and it's already happening. So what can we do? Well, restoration of habitat and connectivity, we've talked about that a lot already, and that's really important for helping animals and plants to move across landscapes and find refuges. So we're already doing things that are really important for this. We also have to think about some invasive species, particularly the introduced gambusia fish is a big problem for invertebrates, and other studies have also shown it's a problem for frogs as well. And we need to start focusing on drought refuges, and that's where the new project comes in. So where is the fresh water in our landscapes then? Has it just vanished completely? Well, not in all of our landscapes it hasn't. So this is the Perth Hills, and there is water there, perennial water there. When the water in the streams and wetlands in the nature reserves and national parks are dry, there is water. And it's in weirs and dams on farms. And it lasts all year round. Some of these systems are on streams, so where streams have been dammed to hold water back. But some of them are quite isolated. So a previous project that we did that I talked about a couple of years ago at this conference looked at these to see, well, is there any native species living in them? And we compared those places to natural systems, the few natural refuges we could find, natural streams. And we compared the isolated and connected dams as well. So we did plants, invertebrates, tadpoles and water quality, and our community volunteers did frog calls and waterbird use using 2 apps. And this is part of the new project as well, because the previous one only lasted for a year. We need a lot more data than that. We need to cover years of different rainfall. So we're again looking for people to record frog calls and waterbird use. Now what we found was really surprising, and I'm not going to talk about this much because I already presented it a couple of years ago, but basically we found a lot of native aquatic plants. We found a lot of native invertebrates. We only found 1 exotic species of invertebrate. So we found that artificial water bodies do support native species, but they vary in their quality. So if we manage them well, they can support higher diversity. And as I mentioned, one of the real limitations to this is this fish, this introduced fish. And one of the good things about those isolated dams is that often they don't have this fish in, and that means they have a whole lot of species that cannot live with this fish present. So our new project then is going to, again, we're going to sample dams, not just in the Perth Hills this time, but also down around Harvey, and natural drought refuges, natural streams and wetlands. We're going to do the same groups we did before, and we're looking for community volunteers to do the frogs and waterbirds. We're also going to look at new methods for managing these water bodies. There's no guidelines for managing them for biodiversity, and they're a bit challenging because the people who have these dams on their properties are using them for things, using them for house water and so on, using them for livestock. So they have to be able to keep on using them. So we need ways that we can increase, support biodiversity that are compatible with those. We also need methods that community groups and individuals can use. We can't have things that require front-end loaders and massive pieces of equipment and moving huge tree trunks around, for example. It's too expensive and it's too difficult. So the end product of this new project then is going to be some guidelines and some demonstration sites. We're going to test 2 new methods for biodiversity, which I'll show you in a second. And we're going to then create some guidelines for people to use to manage these artificial water bodies to support biodiversity.
Would you introduce species into this?
Oh, can you ask me that
Yeah.
question?
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm racing to finish. So we're going to do two things. We're going to add small woody debris, which is tree branches. They're a renewable resource, unlike whole trees, and they provide structure. And we're going to control gambusia. We're going to use specially designed traps at low water level to try and remove gambusia from the isolated wetlands. The connected wetlands they can get back in, but if we can create places without gambusia, we can really give, we think, a good push to the native biodiversity. Now, small woody debris is something that has been used in Eastern Australia mainly for small native fish, but it can perform a lot of different functions. It can provide perches for calling frogs and for territorial dragonflies, help tadpoles emerge out of the water safely. It can help to provide nursery cover for aquatic plants to protect them a bit from waterbird grazing. Provides biofilm, so you can see biofilm here and the tadpoles grazing it like crazy. It provides habitat for invertebrates and tadpoles and a predation refuge as well. All right, so just to finish off then, we do need some help. If you have a property in Kalamunda, Swan, Mundaring or Harvey regions and you're interested in your dams being involved and being surveyed, please get in contact either with me or with Robert. And if you're interested in using the Frog ID or the Bird Data app to record waterbird use at these sites, then also please contact us. We only visit each place a couple of times. We can't collect that sort of data because you need to be there quite often to record frogs and birds, and so that's where our citizen scientists are so tremendously valuable to us. Because particularly if they're on their own property, they can wander down and do some recordings for us and get us some really high quality data. All right, thank you very much. I don't know whether we've got time for questions now or not, but
Oh yeah, you've got that 4 minutes.
okay, great.
4 or 5 minutes.
I'll answer your question. I'll come back to you. Yes. So what did you ask me?
My question was: are you intending to try and increase the biodiversity of the life in those dams?
Yes. So what we're trying at the moment is adding the habitat in form of woody debris and then removing gambusia. Now, what we also would like to do is to, where we've removed the gambusia and got the populations down as low as we can, is to put pygmy perch in.
Yeah.
They provide better mosquito control than the gambusia does, as research by fisheries has shown. But at the moment, we're still exploring how we're going to get the quantities of fish we're going to need. So we're going to have to actually start breeding them, I think. Whole swagger permits needed for all that. So we're still working through that. So initially we can definitely trap them out, and hopefully the second year of the project we will have enough fish to try to put pygmy perch in and swamp any remaining gambusia that are in there.
Well, yeah, because I'm working on an artificial lake or wetland in Catchments, and we're interested in breeding pygmy perch to put back into the system.
Yeah.
So if you've got any contacts, I'd be interested in.
Yeah, this is it. I think this is something that increasingly there's going to be need for and demand for people to be able to supply good numbers of these fish for restoration, because they are perfect, particularly for standing water. So yes, this is a problem that we'll have to try and solve in the next couple of years. Yeah.
Is there a business opportunity in that then?
There might be for someone, yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody had a question. Yeah.
Nice work, Belinda. Give you of practical approaches, so that's great. Just going back to your comparative study, so 30 years is a long time for a system to change, and so what we call common when it comes to species. So is it necessarily bad that some other species have other species become more common? Is it necessarily bad that, because these are naturally changing anyway in all ecosystems?
They are. The value of having that perennial stream in the catchment meant that we could then see how much that had changed, because that was one of Stuart's slides as well. And what we saw there was that diversity and the life history patterns are basically identical to what they were in the 80s. So it's the drying that's driven change. Whether the species that are disappearing, they're probably present. Some of them were present further south, yes. But the drying is going to continue, and the push down to that south coast is going to just, as we get drier from north to south. So keeping somewhere like Waterfall Gully perennial is really important if we want to keep refuges in the longer term, so that if we get on top of our climate change problem and eventually we get increases in rainfall, and I'm thinking in century scales now, those species will still be there, and as things become wetter, they can then spread back out.
Yeah, look, I've got a big pond at home. I'm on clay. It's artificial. All my roof water drains into it. Trees around it, all the appropriate species. But mosquito larvae were my problem. And I just resisted putting gambusia in there, and I put 3 lots of western pygmy perch in there. And you get half a dozen for $49, so they're not cheap. They all die. And so in the end, I put gambusia in. And they've cleaned up the mozzies very quickly. How do I get back to western pygmy perch? And what am I doing wrong?
Yeah, some of the places that we sample in the hills, people that put pygmy perch in, and they've done incredibly well. So I think you would need to try and investigate why they didn't survive in the first place, and there's a whole range of reasons that could be. So if you want to have a bit of a talk about that, or I can put you onto a fish biologist who might even be more help than me.
Good. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, just on the pygmy perch, and there's down at Bunbury and Newton Moor, there's probably in for your schools to be part of the project. So the Newton Moor are breeding pygmy
They do
perch.
black wing, don't they?
No,
No, they pygmy perch, do they?
we did black one.
Black wing.
So there'll probably be an opportunity to include swan river gobies in there as well. So probably trying to look at the diversity of your native fish into your system, because the gobies are just small,
Yeah.
and they're larvae feeded.
Yeah.
So there's probably the opportunity to look at other fish that are in the system.
Definitely down the track there is, but at the moment we just have to show that we're trialling this. The point of the project, as well as collecting the data more generally, is to trial these and see if they actually make a difference. So we're pretty confident if we can get, because of the big difference we got between dams with and without gambusia and the diversity of the native fauna, pretty confident if we can get them down, we'll see a positive response. But we're still not sure whether our trapping methods are going to be, given how they breed. You know, they breed, one female can have 600 offspring in one go. So, you know, we need to trial these methods, and we need to make sure they work. And particularly before we start providing guidelines for people, we want to make sure that what we're saying is actually going to work for people as well. So yes, I agree. If assuming it all goes to plan and it all works, then yes, in the future there's the scope for a whole lot of other types of experiments. There's other methods we could trial that we've considered in terms of managing these systems. So we're right at the start of exploring what's possible.
Those fish that are pests, are they from people unloading their aquariums into the place?
No, they were deliberately spread around Australia for mosquito control.
By who?
Lots of people, government agencies.
Well, can we charge them and get them to breed up some pygmy perch?
And people do move them around now, of course, as well. And a lot of people don't know that they're exotic. They think they're native. To be honest, when we're sitting picking our bugs and members of the public come up and talk to us, often people think they're tadpoles. So there's not very good education. I mean, everyone here knows a lot about wetlands, but the general population who are walking their dog around the wetland don't necessarily know. So they do move things around as well.
If we could all put our hands together.